Well, hello again, and welcome to our second conversation in this 8th series of conversations on the Christian life for the Adult Formation Project at Resurrection Catholic Parish. Welcome again. In our first conversation, we took a look at the history, the long history of humankind, Homo sapiens, beginning at the very advent of life. And one of the things that we saw was that the hominins, that group that will split off from the other great apes, the chimpanzees, the bonobos, the gorillas, and eventually through the whole evolutionary process over a period of about 5 million years, turn out to be us right here in the great Pacific Northwest. Well, according to Father Pagola, we have mentioned him a number of times, and we'll be using his book during the course of these conversations, Jesus and Historical Approximation. We really cannot understand Jesus unless we understand the Roman Empire. And I would dare to say that we really cannot understand the Roman Empire unless we go back even a little bit further. For instance, how about 5.3 million years ago? That seems a little ridiculous. But here's the point. The Mediterranean basin, as we know it today, was not always this way. In fact, here's what it would have looked like about 5.3 million years ago. Here, take a look at this. Of all things, it was a dry basin, except for perhaps a small bit of water in the bottom from runoff and whatnot. How in the world would that develop into what we know as the Mediterranean today? Well, once again, about 5.3 million years ago, something catastrophic happened. In fact, take a look at this picture. This shows the Mediterranean as we know it today. But you'll notice the very tiny gap that separates the Mediterranean from the Atlantic Ocean. That gap used to be sealed up. All part of the plate tectonics between the African plate and the European plate that come together and form that little boundary. However, about 5.3 million years ago, for whatever reason, most likely earthquake in a part of the world that has a lot of earthquakes, that little space broke open. And then what? Keeping in mind that on the other side of that little bridge was the Atlantic Ocean. The water blasted through that. In fact, some scientists say it came through at about the speed of sound, blasted through there, and eventually, over about a 2-year period, filled the Mediterranean basin to what we experience to this very day. That very likely was not the first time that had happened. In fact, indications are that it probably happened off and on over the course of very ancient history, over the course of millions and millions of years. How do we even know that? Well, one of the indicators of that is that at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea, at the present time, there are gigantic salt deposits, some of which are actually, this is hard to believe, as much as 3,000 meters thick. My goodness, huge masses. That's over the years that emptying and filling and emptying and filling would take place. And once again, you may recollect, as we have spoken before, that the earliest hominins would begin to develop in the central part sub-Saharan Africa about 5 million years ago. So this big event had already taken place. The Mediterranean, as we know it, would have happened then. But we begin to see migrations coming up out of Africa about 2 million years ago. This was not Homo sapiens yet. Remember, as we discussed in our first conversation together, Homo sapiens is not going to develop as we know it today up until about 200 to 300,000 years ago, far after this particular time. But migrations very likely began to come up out of Africa about 2 million years ago. What would have driven this? Most likely, it was following the game trails. As the game would move the people would have to move in after it, or those particular critters that would have to move after it. And that gradually led up the eastern side of the Mediterranean Sea, up what is referred to at the present time as the Levant. Now, what's going to be one of the biggest factors in where people are going to actually settle and live? One of the largest factors, of course, is going to be, where was water? On this course up the Levant, and you get to the top of that area, you come to present-day Syria, Iraq, and the two major rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. How about that? That would have been a good stopping place, and it's often referred to even as the cradle of civilization, the Fertile Crescent area between those two great rivers. It was very likely that people then would settle into that area as well, many of them staying right up to the present time. My goodness. Here's a map also that will show where these migrations may have taken place. Oh my gosh, look at this. From up out of Africa, then they will spread across what we would consider to be Europe today, all the way across, up through, over the Bering Straits, and all the way down into northern, central, and southern America, within a span of only 12,000 years ago. Wow, that's that's a lot of wandering. Apparently we as Homo sapiens love to wander, right down, I think, probably to the present time. Always wanting to know just what was over the next hill. Now, if we skip ahead for a pretty good piece of time, we see a region of the globe dominated by various empires, as indicated on this particular map. And this map also shows, notice, the path from the village of Ur in southeastern present-day Iraq near the Persian Gulf, and this journey up to Haran and then down through Syria, Lebanon, Israel, the present day. This was the trek that historians see as the journey of Abraham. When did this occur? Well, we started off way back 5 million years ago. We wandered through 200 and 300,000 years ago. We've seen how people moved into this area, Homo sapiens, by this time, as you'll recollect from our first conversation. Eventually, with this wanderings, the kingdom will be established for the Israelites. The kingdom will begin with Saul, but in many ways, more importantly, with David. David will appear about 1,000 years before the time of Jesus, but his rule and his way of life and his projection to the future will be extremely important in this entire area in the kingdom of Israel. We know that eventually the peoples will be captured and hauled off to Babylon. They will be sent back again to their previous homes, and within that structure they will begin a whole process of rebuilding. A new temple will be built, and life will begin to form in a way immediately preceding the time of Jesus. Now, we're talking here about David at about 1,000 years BC. About 753 BC, we've come to the advent of the Roman Empire, which is where Father Pagola says we need to start if we're going to understand Jesus. But I think that other part is very essential in the understanding of what was going on at the time. So what do we see when we take a look at, in fact, the conquests and whatnot of the kingdom of Israel? Well, we can start in a number of different places. Probably we'd want to start with that young fellow from Macedonia, Alexander. Listen, look at the amount of territory that he covered and that he conquered for himself. Look at that. Absolutely an immense amount of land. Huge. And yet he will die at a fairly young age. Not too long after that, well, from the 4th century down to about the year 63, in the year 63 BC, we'll see another invasion of this important part of the world. this time by the Romans, this time by the general Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Gnaeus Pompey the Great. One of the best parts about it is he gave himself the title of Magnus the Great, and he insisted that everyone call him that. The only one who refused and would call him by a name that he did not want to be called by, it happened to be Gaius Julius Caesar. They were enemies for a long period of time, as well as in some of that time as compatriots. But with the establishment of the Romans in the Palestinian area, as it was referred to, Syria Palestina, we see everything change again. The Romans were tough work. They were domineering. They absolutely dominated an area. As Augustus used to say, when you first move into an area, be sort of kind. If there's any kind of opposition, beat it down, smash it as hard as you possibly can. And that's exactly what they did. They were an absolutely vicious group. They would include the tremendous cruelty, like, for instance, crucifixions, beheadings, enslavements, burning of villages, massacres, whatever it took for them to establish themselves. Jesus will grow up in that environment. He will be completely aware of the dominance and the cruelty of the Romans. So when he talks about them, he knows exactly what he was talking about. The region of the Galilee, where Jesus grew up, and notice on the map here, the region of the galaxy of the Galilee was to the far north of the Holy Lands of Israel. In fact, it's right located near, as part of the whole thing will be the Sea of Galilee, sometimes referred to as the Sea of Tiberias. Jesus would grow up in that area. He grew up in a village named Nazareth, and Nazareth is a short, not too far a distance from, in fact, the Sea of Galilee, a few miles, and it would all be done on foot, of course. Animals that would carry things would not be carrying people, usually for the most part, but baggage or produce, whatever that happened to be. The vast, vast majority of the travel, of course, was by foot. Growing up in Nazareth, by the way, I should probably mention, although some will not like this particular thing, Father Pagola and many scholars think that Jesus was very likely born in Nazareth. Of course, the popular story is that he was born actually in Bethlehem. There's some debate about this. Some will say he was actually born in Nazareth. Nazareth was a very small village, maybe 200 to 400 people. It's on a hill. Why in the world would a village ever have been established there? Well, let's go back to the Fertile Crescent. There was water. And of all things, in the western portion of Nazareth, present-day Nazareth, there was a spring, a very large gushing spring. This was incredibly valuable for the people who would live there, for their animals that had to be taken care of, for the crops that they would grow. So that was one of the main reasons that Nazareth ever would have been founded. Jesus would leave there, as we know, and he will head down toward the Sea of Galilee and end up in a village called Capernaum. Sometimes Capharnaum, but Capernaum. This is where many of his disciples, in fact, will live. We're thinking of Peter and Andrew, for instance. They were from Capernaum. This is the only place that Jesus would have run into any kind of a main thoroughfare. Other than that, it was all trails and pathways. At Capernaum, the Via Maris would come down from the north to Syria and would cut across from there to the Mediterranean, titled the Via Maris, the Way of the Sea. In fact, here's what a portion of the Via Maris probably would have looked like. This was the interstate of its day. Kind of hard to imagine, but that's the way it looked, and that's what it was. It was a footpath, really, in many ways, that would come as again from the north, cut across to the sea, and then follow the Mediterranean on down from there to the south, all the way down to Egypt. Well, if you lived in this area, what was probably your occupation? The Galilee was a very, very poor part of the world. Very, very poor. The vast majority of people living there would have been peasants. Maybe some would have some land, always in danger of losing that land. The landowners themselves would make it as difficult as possible. The taxation rates were absolutely exorbitant. By the time you were done paying your taxes and all the rest, you, in many cases, had really nothing left. Well, what did they grow in this area? In this area, there were black grapes that were grown. There was some wheat, barley. The wheat was the most valuable, so it immediately would have been taken by the Romans and sent off to some place, or by the Jewish authorities and sent somewhere else. This left a little bit of barley left, and barley was referred to often as peasant bread. It would be made into a bread that was not particularly delightful, but it was food. Some millet also would have been grown there. What would they eat? What would they eat? Their diets would consist largely of bread, olives, wine. You had to have wine because in many places the water was not potable. Beans, lentils, figs, some cheese, maybe some salted fish, almost never red meat, and as a treat, perhaps some yogurt, something like that. They were referred to, in fact, Nazareth means people of the countryside. This was not said in any kind of poetic or romantic way. It was very pejorative. These peasants from the countryside, that's how they were seen, and that's how they were treated. As a consequence also, people who were not from that area would tend to look down on folks who were from Nazareth. In fact, as you'll recollect, one of the quotes that comes out of the Bible is, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" It was not seen as a place that you would want to be from. Jesus would eventually, as we know, leave his family. This was very dangerous and extremely unusual. Usually your family life was everything, and that's where you would focus your full attention, would be on your family life. Why would he do such a thing? Well, he was going to leave Nazareth. He'd made up his mind, apparently. He was going to head down toward Capernaum and the sea. This was very, very important to him. But at the same time, he will reject in his sayings and in his dealing with people, he would reject one of the most important parts of the Jewish tradition, and that was the patriarchy. He would continuously reject the notion of the patriarchy. And in even more profound, something unusual from the little villages, he would in fact promote the well-being and the welfare of women. He would take women seriously. Not only women, he would take children seriously. Children were almost discards in many ways because very few of them would, as much as 60%, would never make it to adulthood. They would never make it to age 16. Most of them would die, 60%, before they reached the age of 16. Why? A very poor part of the world, no medical care, malaria, tuberculosis, all kinds of diseases, not to mention injuries. If you were injured, there was nothing to cure you. There were no, for instance, vaccines or anything like that. There were no antibiotics. And so very often, even a relatively minor wound of some sort could turn fatal. It was a very, very difficult time to be alive, and especially in a part of the world like this. Really remarkable. Were there no major cities in the area? Well, yes. Not specifically right there, but near at hand was the city of Sepphoris. Sepphoris was torn down by a general named Quintilius Varus, a particularly horrible person, but so many of the military were. There was also, of course, Jerusalem. These were two major cities, one in the north, one in the south. But for the most part, not so much. How would Jesus even have come in contact with any of these people? Well, as we know from the Gospels, he was an artisan with his father, Joseph. They worked in wood, of course. We think of him as a carpenter, but vastly more than that. Work in stone, even metals of different sorts. They would work in all of these different things as artisans. really quite remarkable. He probably, maybe even his first experience of leaving Nazareth, was to go with Joseph to a place like Sepphoris, where there was building going on. And they would rebuild, in fact, that area for Herod Antipas. The reason Sepphoris had been torn down in the first place was because there was a great revolt, a revolution, after the death of Herod the Great. And with this revolt, the Romans would not put up with that. That's when Varus was sent in to put the whole thing down and destroy it. Also, I mentioned earlier that children were pretty much disregarded within the area in large measure because very few of them would survive it. The process would be, of course, that a young boy would be circumcised by his father at 8 days old. And then he would be turned over to his mother and the women of the village to raise. Not until he was about 8 years old would he then actually be apprenticed or whatever to his father and put in with male companionship. Up until then, it was strictly the women of the village. The village itself would probably have been broken down into houses gathered together around a central, like a patio area, where all the family life would take place from these different houses, different members of the family. It was a very complex society in a very simple manner. The center of life in the Jewish community at that time would be religious life and the religious environment. This was hugely important. That can't be overemphasized, really. It was incredibly important. And out of this would come many of the traditions and whatnot that would play out in everyday Jewish life. Jesus, could he read and write? Was he literate? Most likely not. Only about 3% of the people in the Palestinian area were literate. Very small. It may have been a little bit higher in the Jewish populations because of their great praise of the scriptures that had been written. But the vast majority did not. However, that does not mean that they were not completely conversant in, for instance, the Hebrew scriptures. They had learned them all by heart. From the time they were little tiny folks with their mothers and the other women, they would be learning all the things that they needed to know. Prayer would happen twice a day, morning and evening. The most common of the prayers, of course, was the Shema. The Shema means hear or listen up. Extremely important prayer, used right down to the present day in Jewish ceremonies. Did Jesus live up to all of the expectations that would have been expected of him in his family life? Probably not. In fact, there are 7 things in Jewish tradition, 7 things condemned by heaven, according to the Jewish tradition. And the first of these is a man without a woman. Jesus, as far as we know, never married, had no children. That would have been absolutely outrageous within the community at the time. Why would he do something like that? Or not do something like that? He was totally and completely dedicated and devoted to the idea of the reign of God, or as Elaine Park would put it, as the presence of God. This was hugely important to him. And that will be one of the conversations that we'll have in the conversations coming up in the next few sessions. My goodness. So, a relatively complex society in a very simple way, in which he would grow up, in which he would leave. And that will go directly into his association with John the Baptist, with other members of the Baptist Society, and eventually will take him to his own destiny. Truly remarkable. Well, these first 2 conversations have been just really introductions to the main intent of the series, an introduction of the path of Homo sapiens toward ethical morality, beginning long ago and coming down to a high point in Western civilization in many ways with the life of Jesus. Now we're going to take a look at 5 ways in which Jesus impacted our search with 5 very special guests. I think you will appreciate them immensely and really enjoy what they have to say. And finally, as I had mentioned in our introductory piece, we will examine the notion of the American Jesus. Sometimes a person barely recognizable from the person of the Scriptures. This should be very interesting. Thank you for being with us today, and I'll look forward to our next conversation together in which we will begin talking with our guests. And in the meanwhile, blessings always.